Hello class, Norman Stevens here for Economics 102 Macroeconomics. Today I'd like to review Chapter 10, Finance, Saving, and Investment. You might ask, why is this topic important besides being the subject of our next exam? Understanding the financial institutions and markets is crucial to understanding what finances investment in capital and helps our economy grow. The health of the financial markets spreads and affects the performance of every other market, such as labor and the market for goods and services. The recent stock market shocks and global financial crisis are examples of the importance of understanding financial markets and help us recognize that, like it or not, our fates are tied to the markets. Let's get started. I want to begin with a variety of definitions. Finance is the lending and borrowing that moves funds from savers to spenders. Money is the object or objects that people use to make payments. Physical capital is the tools, instruments, machines, buildings, and other items that have been produced in the past and are used to produce goods and services. Financial capital is the funds firm used to buy and operate physical capital. Investment increases the quantity of capital, and depreciation decreases it. Gross investment is the total amount spent on new capital goods. Net investment equals gross investment minus depreciation. The change in the quantity of capital is net investment. Figure 10.1 illustrates the relationship between capital and investment. On January 1st, 2012, Tom's DVD Burning Incorporated had DVD recording machines valued at $30,000. That's his capital at the beginning of the year. During 2012, the value of Tom's machines fell by $20,000 due to depreciation. That is, the machines lost their value with time and they get old or need maintenance, so their value drops. One way to think about depreciation is if you bought a new car from a dealership. The second your foot hits the gas pedal and you move the car is no longer new. You are the first owner and its value has dropped. It is depreciated and lost some value. So back to Tom. Now the value of Tom's machines is $30,000 minus $20,000 to $10,000. During 2012, Tom spent $30,000 on new machines. That's gross investment. Tom's net investment is the current value of his machines at $10,000 plus the new amount of money he spent on machines, $30,000. So at the end of 2012, Tom had capital valued at $40,000. That is $10,000 plus $30,000. Back to our definitions. Wealth is the value of all the things that a person owns. Saving is the amount of income that is not paid in taxes or spent on consumption goods and services. Saving adds to wealth. Wealth also increases when the market value of assets rises, called capital gains. To make real GDP grow, saving and wealth must be transformed into investment and capital. This process takes place through financial institutions and markets for financial capital. And what do those markets look like? Well, savings finances investment in the three types of financial markets. The loan markets. Loans from banks or way firms finance their short-term capital needs and how households get funds to buy new homes. Bond markets. A bond is a promise to pay specified sums of money on specified dates and is a debt for the issuer of the bond. Firms and governments sell bonds to raise funds. The bond market is the financial market in which bonds issued by firms and governments are traded. Firms often issue short-term bonds as a way of getting paid for their sales before the buyer is able to pay. Treasury bills are short-term bonds issued by the U.S. Treasury. Mortgage-backed securities, which were at the center of the 2007 to 2008 financial storm, are bonds that entitle the holder to the income from a package of mortgages. Stock markets. A stock is a certificate of ownership and claim to the profits that a firm makes. The stock market is a financial market in which shares of company stocks are traded. Examples include the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, the London Stock Exchange, the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and the Tokyo Stock Exchange. It's important to recognize that ownership of the stock is not the same thing as the physical capital that is discussed in the textbook. There is a distinction between financial capital and physical capital. Stock ownership represents the financial side. The actual building, machines, and equipment that these firms use represent physical capital. On to financial institutions. A financial institution is a firm that operates on both sides of the markets for financial capital. It borrows in one market and lends in another. The key financial institutions are investment banks, for one, those firms that help other financial institutions and governments raise funds by issuing and selling bonds and stocks, as well as providing advice on transactions, such as mergers and acquisitions. Commercial banks provide banking services, such as accepting deposits and making loans and issuing credit cards. Government-sponsored mortgage lenders buy mortgages from banks, package them into mortgage-backed securities, and sell them. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are two government-sponsored mortgage lenders that were taken over by the federal government in September 2008. Pension funds use the pension contributions of firms and workers to buy bonds and stocks. And insurance companies, they enter into agreements with households and firms to provide compensation in the event of misfortune, such as accident, theft, fire, firm failure. Insurance companies receive premiums from their customers, make payments against claims, and use the excess funds to buy bonds and stocks on which they earn interest. Profit is the gap between the incoming flow of funds from premiums and interest and the outgoing flow of funds from paying claims, which can turn negative. With large and widespread losses, it can be difficult for the insurer to meet their obligations. A financial institution's net worth is the total market value of what it has lent minus the market value of what it has borrowed. If the net worth is positive, the institution is solvent and can remain in business. If the net worth is negative, the institution is insolvent and must stop trading. A firm is illiquid if it has made long-term loans which borrowed funds and is faced with a sudden demand to repay more of what it has borrowed than is available in cash. Normally, an illiquid financial institution can borrow from another institution, though this becomes difficult if all financial institutions are short on cash. Insolvency and illiquidity were at the core of the 2007-2008 financial meltdown. Moving on to interest rates and asset prices, stocks, bonds, short-term securities, and loans are collectively called financial assets. The interest rate on a financial asset is a percentage of the price of an asset. There is an inverse relationship between an asset price and interest rate. Due to the interconnectivity, common influences, and common interest rate trends, all financial markets can be analyzed as one single market. The loanable funds market is the aggregate, that is the total of all the individual financial markets. And what are the flows like in the loanable funds market? Loanable funds are used for business investment, government budget deficit, and international investment or lending. These are the sources of the demand for loanable funds. Loanable funds come from private saving, government budget surplus, and international borrowing. These are the sources of supply of loanable funds. We'll look at the demand for loanable funds. The demand for loanable funds is the demand to finance business investment, government budget deficit, and international investment or lending. The largest source of these is the demand to finance investment, so it dominates the demand for loanable funds. Investment depends on two factors: the real interest rate and expected profit. Firms invest only when the expected profit rate exceeds the real interest rate. Investment is inversely related to the real interest rate. So, other things remaining the same, the higher the real interest rate, the smaller is the quantity of loanable funds demanded, and the lower the real interest rate, the greater is the quantity of loanable funds demanded. We can see this in the graph for the demand for loanable funds, and it's the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds demanded and the real interest rate. As illustrated in that figure, the demand for loanable funds curve is downward sloping, showing a negative relationship between the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds demanded. A change in expected profit changes the demand for loanable funds and shifts the demand for loanable funds curve. An increase in expected profit increases investment. The demand for loanable funds increases, and the demand for loanable funds curve shifts rightward. Now be sure not to confuse saving with investment. The downward slope of the demand for loanable funds curve might be puzzling. Ask yourself the following question. If the interest rate rises, I'm going to put more money in my savings account. So why do we say that a higher interest rate decreases investment and the demand for loanable funds? Well, the answer is that a higher interest rate increases the cost of the financial capital used to buy physical capital, and hence decreases the quantity of loanable funds demanded. You can make the observation that an increase in real interest rate affects firms similarly to the way an increase in the interest rate on student loans affects students. The higher interest rate in this case is a cost to the borrower, not interest that is earned for the borrower. So keep that distinction in mind, that one is a cost, not something that's profitable. Another way to understand the demand for loanable funds is to think about Amazon.com's decision to borrow $100 million to build some new warehouses. Suppose that Amazon expected to get a return of $5 million a year from this investment before paying interest costs. If the interest rate is less than 5% a year, Amazon expects to make a profit, so it builds the warehouses. If the interest rate is more than 5% a year, Amazon expects to incur a loss, so it doesn't build the warehouses. The quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater, the lower is the interest rate. Figure 10.3 shows changes in demand for loanable funds. When the expected profit changes, the demand for loanable funds changes. Other things remaining the same, the greater the expected profit from new capital, the greater is the amount of investment, and the greater is the demand for loanable funds. An increase in expected profit increases investment and shifts the demand for loanable funds curve rightward to DLF1. The expected profit rises during a business cycle expansion and falls during a recession. It rises when technological change creates profitable new products. It rises as a growing population brings increased demand, and it fluctuates or changes with contagious swings of optimism and pessimism. Those are called animal spirits by Keynes and irrational exuberance by Alan Greenspan. A demand and expected profit decreases investment and shifts the demand for loanable funds leftward to DLF2. We'll look at the supply of loanable funds. The supply of loanable funds is the supply from private saving, government budget surplus, and international borrowing. The largest source of these is from private saving, so it dominates the supply of loanable funds. Saving depends on the real interest rate, disposable income, wealth, expected future income, and default risk. Saving is positively related to the real interest rate. So, other things remaining the same, the higher the real interest rate, the greater is the quantity of loanable funds supplied. And the lower the real interest rate, the smaller is the quantity of loanable funds supplied. The supply of loanable funds is the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds supplied and the real interest rate, other things remaining the same. As illustrated in the figure, the supply of loanable funds curve is upward sloping, showing the positive relationship between the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds supplied. A change in disposable income, that is income minus net taxes, a change in wealth, a change in expected future income, a change in the default risk, all those change the supply of loanable funds and shift the supply of the loanable funds curve. A decrease in disposable income, an increase in wealth, an increase in expected future income, and a greater default risk all decrease saving. The supply of loanable funds decreases, and the supply of loanable funds curve shifts leftward. We can look at equilibrium in the loanable funds market. The loanable funds market is in equilibrium when the real interest rate is such that the quantity of loanable funds supplied equals the quantity of loanable funds demanded. There is neither a surplus nor a shortage of saving, so the borrowers can get the funds they demand and the lenders can lend all the funds they have available. In the figure, the equilibrium level of loanable funds is 6% and $2 trillion of funds. Let's say that the demand for loanable funds increases, perhaps because of an increase in expected profit that increases investment. The demand for loanable funds curve shifts rightward. The equilibrium real interest rate rises, and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds increases. If the real interest rate rises to 8% a year, the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. There is a surplus of funds. The real interest rate eventually falls back to 6%. Let's say in another example that the supply of loanable funds increases, perhaps because of an increase in disposable income that increases saving, and the supply of loanable funds curve shifts rightward. As the figure shows, the equilibrium real interest rate falls from 6% to 4% in the figure, and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds increases from $2 trillion to $2.5 trillion in the figure. If the real interest rate is 4% a year, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. There is a shortage of funds. The real interest rate eventually rises back to 6%. We can look at the government in the loanable funds market. A government budget surplus increases the supply of loanable funds. With the increase in the supply of loanable funds, the real interest rate falls, which decreases private savings and decreases the quantity of private loanable funds supplied. That is, there's a movement along the price supply of the loanable funds curve. The lower real interest rate increases the quantity of loanable funds demanded and increases investment. In the figure, the private supply of funds curve is labeled PSLF. The government budget surplus is equal to $1 trillion, which is the length of the double-headed arrow. The total supply of loanable funds is the sum of private supply of loanable funds plus government budget surplus. The supply of loanable funds curve is labeled SLF in the figure. The government budget surplus lowers the equilibrium real interest rate from 6% to 4%. It increases the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds from $2 trillion to $2.5 trillion. Because of the lower real interest rate, the quantity of private loanable funds, that is, the quantity of private saving, decreases by $500 billion. A government budget deficit increases the demand for loanable funds. The real interest rate rises, which increases private savings and increases the quantity of private loanable funds supplied. The higher real interest rate decreases investment and the quantity of loanable funds demanded by firms to finance investment. The tendency for a government budget deficit to raise the real interest rate and decrease investment is called the crowding out effect. The Ricardo-Barrow effect says that a government deficit leads rational taxpayers to expect higher future taxes and lower disposable incomes, thereby causing them to increase current saving. Private saving and the private supply of loanable funds offset the deficit. As a result, the real interest rate does not change and investment is not crowded out. While private savings may change in the direction predicted by the Ricardo-Barrow effect to lessen the influence of the budget deficit on investment and the real interest rate, most economists agree that a full Ricardo-Barrow effect is unlikely.